The sky above the alien market was full of smoke and flashing lights as traders shouted over each other, trying to sell strange goods from far-off planets. While creatures big and small moved through the crowd, looking for something to buy or steal, or take for free. But near the center of the market stood a high platform made of rusted metal, where the last auction of the night was about to begin. And this one was different, because on that stage stood a girl, not from any known race, and not wearing chains like the others before her, but still not trying to run away. Her skin was pale with blue patterns that shimmered like stars when the light hit her just right, and her eyes were sharp and gold, like twin suns, staring at everyone like she was the one deciding their fate instead of the other way around. And her body was thin but strong, her arms tense, her fingers like claws, her long dark hair falling wild across her shoulders and back like something that belonged to the forest, not the stars. The crowd was not quiet because of respect or fear of the auctioneer. No, they were quiet because they knew this girl was different. She was dangerous, not tamed, not broken, not safe. The auctioneer cleared his throat and spoke in a loud voice, trying to sound brave, though sweat dripped from his neck. This rare creature, this final item has great value, strong, wild, and untouched by control tech, a perfect prize for any warlord, collector, or scientist willing to take the risk. No one moved, no one spoke, not even the rich buyers from the core worlds, who had spent fortunes on other items tonight, because they had all heard stories. Whispers of a girl found on a ruined research base, full of dead guards and broken doors, and a single open cage, and that cage had belonged to her. The auctioneer tried again, his voice cracking a little, as he added, "She is strong, fast, smart. She has learned language from listening alone, and shows signs of advanced memory and instinctive fighting skill. We believe she may be from an unknown hybrid experiment, lost during the fall of the Kuro's labs, perhaps even a living weapon." Still, the crowd only stared. Some backed away slightly, others whispered in fear. One trader from the Edgeworlds said, "I heard she tore out a man's throat with her teeth, and didn't even blink." Another whispered she melted a soldier's armor just by touching it, and someone else said, "No, that was just heat tech she stole from the lab." But it didn't matter what was true and what was rumor, because the fear was real and heavy in the air. The girl on the stage looked at no one in particular. She seemed bored. Maybe angry, maybe tired. Her mouth was closed. Her chest rose and fell slowly, like she was waiting for something, waiting for someone. The auctioneer finally lowered his voice and said, "If no one bids, she will be returned to containment or sent back to Sector Black for disposal. We cannot keep her unsecured, and she will not follow orders." He began to raise his hand to end the auction, his eyes already moving to the guards nearby, ready to take her away. And then it happened. A single voice called out from the back, not loud but clear, "I'll pay the full price." Every head turned, and many gasped. The guards froze, the auctioneer blinked in shock, and the girl tilted her head slightly, as if she had heard something strange but interesting. A man stepped forward through the crowd, not tall, not strong-looking, just a simple human with a travel jacket and a calm face and eyes that looked straight at the girl, not with fear, not with hunger, not with command, but with quiet thought. He raised his hand again and said, "I'll take her full price. No bargain, no return." The auctioneer stammered, You are sure, sir, she is not safe?" The man nodded. "I am sure. I don't think she was meant to be safe." And then the silence grew deeper than before. The girl on the stage blinked once, then stepped forward slowly, her eyes locked onto his. Her body tensed but still, and for a moment it felt like the market itself had stopped moving. No laughter, no talking, no lights, no wind, just the sound of her steps and the breath of one human who dared to raise his hand when no one else would. She stopped at the edge of the platform, staring down at him. He looked up without flinching, and for a moment they just looked at each other. No one spoke, no one moved. Then the auctioneer finally said, "Sold," and the guards didn't dare touch her. She jumped down from the stage without a sound, landing like a shadow beside the man, and together they walked away, leaving the silent crowd behind. Some stared in awe, some in fear, and some in confusion, but none followed, none spoke. And so the wild alien girl who no one wanted was taken by the one person no one expected, and no one knew what would happen next, not even her. The ship was small and old, with scratches on the outside and dust on the inside, and the seats were patched with pieces of old cloth and metal. The control panel had blinking lights, but most of them were not working, and the air smelled like oil and heat. But the man did not care, and the girl did not complain. She sat in the corner of the main room with her knees up, and her eyes watching everything, while the man checked the systems and set the course away from the auction world. His name was Yalan, and he did not say much, but his voice was soft and steady when he spoke, and he offered her a small cup of water and a dried food pack, and he did not try to touch her or ask her questions. He just let her sit where she felt safe, and he moved slowly, like he did not want to scare her. The girl did not speak, but her eyes said many things, sharp eyes, golden and bright, like suns, always moving, always watching. Sometimes she growled low when he got too close, but Yalan never showed fear. He only nodded and gave her space again, and sometimes he would talk to her even if she did not reply, just simple things like what planet they were near, or what he was fixing on the ship. She did not sleep the first night. She sat with her back to the wall, and her head low, but her eyes never closed, and she held a sharp piece of metal she had picked up from the floor like a weapon, and Yalan noticed, but did not take it away. He only said, if you need it to feel safe, then keep it. By the second night, she had moved to a corner near the small heater, and her body was more relaxed. Her eyes not so wide, her hands not so tight. And Yalan left some warm food nearby, without looking at her, and when he returned, the plate was empty, and the sharp metal was on the floor untouched. She still did not speak, but she followed him with her eyes, and listened to every word and every sound, and when a warning light blinked red, she was already standing near the hatch with her body tense, and her hands curled like claws, ready to fight, even though there was no real threat. Just an old wire sparking near the vent on the third day. Yalan showed her a small screen with images of planets, stars, and ships, and said, this is what's out there, and these are the places I've seen, and maybe one day you can choose where you want to go. And she looked at the screen for a long time, but said nothing, and he did not push her. He only smiled, and turned back to his work. That night the ship shook from a passing storm cloud, and loud thunder rolled over the hull, and Yalan stood up to check the systems, but before he could move, the girl grabbed his arm tight, her eyes wide, her breath fast, and her whole body shaking, not from fear of the storm, but from something deeper, something buried in her mind. He did not pull away, he just stood still, and let her hold on until the shaking stopped, and she let go, and moved back to her corner, breathing slow again, and Yalan said softly, you are not a monster. You are just scared, and hurt like the rest of us. The next morning, he found her sitting near the control panel, her fingers touching buttons, but not pressing them, her eyes full of questions, and her voice soft and broken. When she asked, what is that? And Yalan looked at her with surprise, not because she spoke, but because her voice was not cold or wild, it was curious. He sat beside her and said that one controls the nav, and that one adjusts the engine flow, and this one plays music. If it still works. And she looked at him, then at the buttons, and then back at him again, like she was trying to understand why he was kind, why he was not afraid. Later he told her his name, and she repeated it slowly, Yalan, and then asked, what am I? And he did not know how to answer, because she was not just a girl, or a weapon, or a science project. She was something more, so he said, you are. You, and that is enough for now. She did not reply, but she did not growl or run or hide, and that was something. And when he asked if he could call her Ray, she looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once, and so the wild girl who had no name now had a word that belonged to her, and the man who had no reason to care now had a reason to keep going, and the space between them began to change. The ship floated through the stars in silence, as days passed slowly, and Ray began to walk more often, instead of sitting in corners. Her steps light and quiet, like a shadow moving through air, her eyes always alert, her hands touching the walls, and tools and wires, as if she was trying to remember something from a time before her cage. Yalan never stopped her, he just watched, and sometimes showed her how things worked, but never forced her to speak. Never asked her to explain the strange scars across her back, or the way she flinched at sudden lights or loud sounds. One night Ray stood near the window, staring out at a red planet with rings of ice floating around it, her fingers pressed to the glass, her breath slow and deep, as if she had seen that place before. And Yalan said softly, it's called Sirith. They mined the ice for fuel before the war. Ray said nothing but did not look away, and Yalan waited a little, then left her alone, because he had learned that silence from her often meant more than words. Later that same night, Ray did not sleep. She sat on the floor in the engine room, knees pulled to her chest, eyes wide in the dark, and when Yalan passed by to check the cooling system, she whispered, stop. He froze and listened. And she whispered again, softer, do you hear it? And at first he did not, but then he noticed her hands were shaking, and her face was pale, and her breath came fast and shallow. Yalan knelt beside her and said, it's just the pipes cooling down. But Ray shook her head and said, no, it's them. And she covered her ears and rocked gently, like she was trying to escape something inside her mind, and her voice cracked as she said over and over, I don't want to go back. I don't want to go back. I don't want to go back. Yalan sat with her until the shaking stopped, and her breath slowed and her eyes closed, and when she opened them again, they were wet and tired and full of pain she could not name. And he said, you're safe here, Ray. And She nodded slowly, and leaned her head against the wall, her voice small. When she whispered, they kept me underground, cold light metal walls, hands. Always cold, needles, always burning, sometimes sleep, sometimes not sleep, just dark, just quiet, just screaming. In my head she stopped and pressed her hands to her temples, and Yolan said, "You don't have to tell me anything else, not if it hurts," and Ray said, "It always hurts," and Yolan nodded, and said, "Then I'll just sit here with you until it hurts a little less." In the days that followed, Ray began to speak more, not often, but more than before, sometimes asking about stars or words or machines, sometimes sharing pieces of memories. Like broken glass floating in space, she remembered white suits and red gloves. She remembered numbers on walls and voices through glass. She remembered pain that taught her to obey, and then pain that punished her for not obeying fast enough. Yolan never asked her to be more than she was. He never looked at her like she was a tool or a threat. He treated her like someone worth saving, even when she broke things by accident, or froze in fear, or screamed in her sleep. And slowly she started to sit closer during meals, and even touched his arm once when he laughed too loud at a joke the ship's old radio told one afternoon. Ray found an old datapad under the pilot seat and brought it to Yolan, and asked, "What is this?" And he smiled and said it was his grandfather's journal full of old stories and maps and dreams. And Ray opened it and read the first line out loud, which said, "I once dreamed of flying to a world where no one knew my name." And Ray looked up and said, "I like that world." And Yolan said, "Maybe we'll find it that night." Ray did not sleep. Alone, she brought her blanket near his chair and sat beside him, not touching, but close enough that she could hear his breathing, and she whispered, "Thank you," before closing her eyes. And Yolan whispered back, "Anytime, Ray, anytime." In the quiet of the ship, with stars sliding past the window and machines humming low, Ray's past still lived inside her, like fire and ice and broken glass. But now there was something else too. Something small, but growing like light behind a locked door, and Yolan knew the past could not be erased, but maybe it could be softened, maybe it could be shared, and maybe that would be enough to change her future. The stars outside the window looked calm and peaceful, but something in the air had changed. Ray could feel it before Yolan even said a word. Her body stiff, her eyes sharp as she walked through the ship, checking doors, vents, and storage like an animal sensing a storm. Long before it came, Yolan sat in front of the screen, reading the same blinking message again and again, a red code flashing over the ship logs, not from the system, not from an update, but from an outside signal hidden deep in the trade network. The words were short and cold: subject, located high-value target, extreme caution. Required bounty active 10 million credits, alive or intact. Ray stood behind him without making a sound, her arms crossed, her voice low when she said, "They found me." Yolan turned and looked at her face, and it was not fear he saw, but quiet rage. And Yolan knew they would not stop, and Ray knew they would not wait. That night, Yolan ran full system sweeps, clearing trace signals, changing ship ID codes, wiping memory ports, anything to hide their trail. But Ray said it would not matter. They do not need names or codes. They smell fear, and they follow it until there is nothing left. Yolan asked, "Who are they?" And Ray said, "Cold men with cold hands, not like bounty hunters, not like traders. These ones wear black suits and speak in numbers. They made me, and they want me back." Yolan loaded every weapon on the ship and showed Ray how to fire them, but she already knew. Her hands moved like memory. Not learning, she handled the rifle like an old friend, and the shock blade like it belonged in her grip. Yolan watched her and said, "I hope we never need these," and Ray said, "We will." They reached a refueling station near a dead moon, where the stars were too far and the light was too dim, and while Yolan traded credits for water and fuel, Ray waited inside the ship, eyes on the scanner, hands resting near the controls. Then the lights flickered once, twice, and the scanner went blank for a breath, then blinked red. She whispered Yolan into the mic, but got no answer, and her heart beat faster, not from panic, but from knowing this was how it always began. Yolan walked back from the trade station with a small box in hand. When he saw them, 3 tall figures in smooth armor, no faces, no names, just black helmets and black boots, walking straight toward the ship, and straight toward him. Ray saw them through the window and opened the hatch, ready to fight, ready to burn the ship if needed. But Yolan held up a hand, not to stop her, but to calm her. He walked slow, steady, like he belonged there, like nothing was wrong. And the black suits stopped and stared. One spoke with a voice like cold metal and said, "We want the asset, return her, and we will let you live." Yolan smiled, but there was no joy in it, and he said, "No, I think you are out of date. She is not yours anymore." The man in the suit stepped forward and raised a hand, and something blinked red in his palm, but before the signal left his skin, Ray was already outside her body, fast, her movement silent as she struck his arm with the blade and knocked him to the ground. The other 2 raised weapons, but Yolan shot first, hitting one in the leg, and Ray finished the other with a growl. The fight was fast and hard, and left the dust around them black and hot, and when it was done, Ray stood over the last man, her blade near his throat, and she asked why now, why me, and he answered in numbers and codes, and said she was unstable. She was property, she was a breach of protocol, and Ray said, I am none of those, and she let him live, but broke his leg so he would not follow back on the ship. Yolan breathed hard, wiping blood from his cheek, and Ray sat beside him, her chest rising fast, her hands red and shaking. She said, I do not want to be what they made me, and Yolan took her hand and said, then be something else, be someone you choose to be, as the ship left the dead moon behind, and the stars grew brighter. Ray sat at the window again, her mind full of noise, but her heart beating steady for the first time in years, and Yalan watched her, and knew the fight was not over, not yet, but something had changed. Ray had chosen not to run, but to stand, and that choice would shape everything that came next. The stars moved slowly above, as the ship floated near a quiet system full of broken satellites and dead machines, and Yalan used this place to hide while the engines cooled, but Ray stood in silence by the window, her face blank, her fingers pressed to the glass, as if she could feel something calling to her from far away. Not a voice, not a sound, but something deeper, like a whisper in her bones, and Yalan watched her with careful eyes, knowing she had changed since the fight, and not just in how she moved but in how she breathed, and how she stood like the wild inside her, had shifted into something more. Yolan worked late into the night, scanning her blood from a small sample left on the deck after the last fight, and what he found made his chest tighten, and his hands' slow raised cells were not normal. They were shaped and coded, with layers of strange patterns hidden deep like locks inside her very body, and as he read more, he found words he did not want to see, terms like activation, threshold and combat override, and memory gate, and then a phrase that burned into his screen, sleeper state, unstable use, only in controlled zones. He sat back in his chair and whispered, what did they do to you? And he closed the screen and looked toward the hallway where Ray had gone quiet, and Yalan felt something heavy in the air, like the truth had been waiting to be found, and now that it was seen, it could not be ignored. Later, Ray stood in the engine room, holding a broken wire like it was a knife, and her hands trembled, not from fear, but from memory, and she said in a voice, low and rough, I remember glass walls, I remember lights in my skin. I remember a room with no time, and a voice that said, I would be the end of them all. Yalan stepped closer and said, you do not have to be what they made you. And Ray said, they made me to kill, and to obey, and to burn everything that stood in my way. I was not born, I was built. Yalan sat beside her on the floor, and said, I do not care what they built, I see what you are now, and that is not a weapon, it is a person. And Ray looked at him, and asked, what if I cannot control it? And Yalan said, then I will help you until you can, and if you cannot ever, then I will still stay with you, because you are not alone, not anymore. The ship shook suddenly, not from attack, but from Ray herself, her hands glowing faint, and her breath fast, as if something inside her had stirred, and her voice cracked when she said, I feel it waking, I feel it trying to take me. And Yalan took her hand and said, then fight it, Ray, fight it with everything you have. And she closed her eyes and screamed, but the scream was silent like a storm locked inside. And then it passed, and she fell into his arms, weak but awake. And not lost. The next day, Ray asked him to open the hidden file. He found the one with her code and her history, and together they read the lines written by Cold Minds in Cold Labs project. Name Silent Dawn. Subject shows signs of emotional resistance. Subject refused to kill on command. Subject terminated 3 handlers. Subject marked for disposal. And Ray read those lines again and again, and said, I did not want to hurt them. I just wanted to be free. Yalan held her hand and said, you are free now. And Ray asked then, why does it still hurt? And Yalan said, because you remember, and that means you are still human even. If they tried to take that from you, they flew to an old world covered in forests where no one lived, now just trees and rivers and wind. And there Ray walked under open sky for the first time, and touched real grass, and stood in cold rain, and shouted at the clouds, and laughed and cried at the same time. And Yalan watched her and smiled, because in that moment she was not a weapon, not a test, not a prisoner, just a girl who had never seen a sky before. That night Ray sat by the fire they built from old wood, and said, I think I want to be something more than what they made me. And Yalan said, you already are. And Ray said, then let me prove it. And Yalan said, you already have, but far above the forest in the black of space. A signal had been sent, and a new ship had received it, and inside that ship were voices that knew her name, and knew her code, and knew that she had begun to wake. The forest was quiet, with only the sound of leaves moving, and the fire crackling, as Ray sat near the edge of the hill watching the stars above, with her knees pulled to her chest, and her eyes locked on a bright shape that moved slowly across the night sky. And Yalan came beside her, holding 2 metal cups with warm tea, and said nothing at first, but then said softly, that is not a star. And Ray nodded slowly and said, I know. They watched the light grow larger as it came closer, moving with a pattern too perfect to be natural and too smooth to be friendly, and Ray's breath changed and her shoulders stiffened and her voice dropped low as she said, they are here. And Yalan asked how many, and Ray closed her eyes and said, enough to end us both. Yalan moved fast, packing gear, loading weapons, checking systems while Ray stood in the middle of the clearing like a statue, her hands glowing faint, and her heart beat like thunder inside her ears, not from fear but from something deeper, like something old inside her waking up again and pulling at her mind, and she clenched her fists and whispered, not yet, not now, not again. When the ship came down, it did not land with noise. It came like a ghost, a black shape, folding out of the clouds and settling on the grass without shaking a leaf, and then a ramp opened, and 6 figures walked out, all in black armor with glowing red visors, and they moved like one mind, one will, one purpose, and behind them came a taller figure in silver with a voice that echoed through the trees, as he said, return what belongs to us, and we will spare the human. Yalan stepped forward with his rifle, but Ray placed a hand on his arm, and shook her head slowly, and then stepped past him toward the soldiers, her voice calm but loud as she said, I do not belong to you, and I never will. And the man in silver tilted his head and said, you were built for command, you were born in silence and grown in pain, you are the key to our order, and your place is not beside trash, it is at the front of our war. Ray looked back at Yalan, and he nodded once, and raised his weapon, and Ray turned again, and said then, you will have to take me, and the ground beneath. Her feet cracked as her power lit her skin with soft light, and her eyes turned gold like suns, and the soldiers raised their arms, but she was already moving fast and fierce, like lightning given form, and her blade cut through air and armor alike. The fight burned like fire in the forest as trees fell and smoke rose, and Yalan fired from cover, hitting the soldiers who tried to flank. Ray moved like a storm, full of rage and memory, and will not to kill but to stop, to break, to hold back the ones who came to chain her again. And the man in silver stepped onto the field with a staff of black energy and struck Ray hard across the chest, sending her flying into the dirt. She stood again, blood on her lips and fire in her eyes, and said, I am not your weapon. He laughed and said, no, you are more than that, you are the future of control. And Ray screamed a sound full of pain and defiance, and everything she had lost, and rushed him again. Her hands bright, her voice strong, her body moving faster than fear. Yalan ran to her side, firing at the last soldiers, and when the final one fell, Ray and the silver man stood face to face, both shaking, both burning, both refusing to fall, and he said, you were never meant to choose, and Ray said, then that is why I will win, and with one final cry, she struck his staff and shattered it in light. The ship tried to lift off, but Ray raised her hands and pulled its systems to the ground with raw force, and the engines exploded in the air with a sound like thunder. And Yalan pulled her back as the fire rained down, and they landed hard together, in the grass, safe but shaking later in the dark. Ray sat beside the ashes of the ship, her body tired, her mind quiet, and Yalan said, you did not kill them all, you held back. And Ray said, I am not what they wanted me to be. And Yalan said, no, you are not, and that is a good thing. And Ray looked at him with tired eyes and said, then tell me, Yalan, what am I now? And he smiled and said, you are free, and you are strong, and you are someone I would trust with my life. And Ray looked at her hands, then at the stars, then back at him, and whispered, then maybe I can trust myself too. The morning came soft and quiet, with light falling through the trees and mist rising from the grass, and Ray sat by the river washing the blood from her hands, while the cold water flowed fast around her fingers, and her eyes stared at the ripples, like they held answers she had been searching for her whole life. And behind her Yalan moved slowly, holding a small pack of supplies, and calling her name. With a voice still rough from smoke and pain, but steady and warm, like always, she turned to him, and her face was calm and her voice was quiet. When she said, I thought it would feel different, and Yalan asked, what do you mean? And Ray looked down and said, winning, surviving, choosing my own way. I thought it would feel bigger, louder, brighter, but it just feels quiet. And Yalan nodded and sat beside her and said, maybe quiet is what freedom sounds like. They stayed on that world for 3 more days, while the systems cooled and the burns healed, and Ray spent most of her time walking through the trees alone, breathing the air and touching the bark and watching the sky. And Yalan did not follow or question, he just made sure the ship was ready and the path was clear, because he knew that even when the fight was over, the war inside her was not, and healing would not come from words alone. The 4th morning, Ray stepped into the ship without looking back, and Yalan asked, where to? And she said, anywhere with stars and peace. And he smiled and said, I think I know a place. And they lifted into the sky together, with the world shrinking beneath them, and the stars growing ahead like lights in a dark tunnel. And Ray sat in the front seat for the first time, her hands on the controls, and her face full of quiet hope. They traveled far past the edge of known space, into systems with no names and no maps, and there they found a small moon circling a blue giant of place no one had claimed or ruined, and Ray said here, and they landed in silence on soft white soil, and built a small home from old parts and new dreams, and each day Ray walked further from the ship and closer to herself. She learned to plant food, and fix engines, and speak more words, and feel more things, and Yolan watched her grow, not with power, but with peace. And every night they sat by the fire under stars. She once feared and talked about everything, and nothing, and Rie would sometimes laugh. And it was the kind of laugh that only comes from someone who never thought they would ever laugh again. One day a small ship came from the stars, broken and lost, with only a child inside, a thin alien boy with silver skin and wide black eyes, and Ray was the first to reach him, and she held him in her arms and said, "You are safe now." And she looked at Yolan, and he saw something new in her eyes, not rage, not pain, not fear, but care. And Ray said, "We cannot send him away, he has nowhere." And Yolan said, "Then he stays with us." The boy stayed, and Ray taught him how to fish and read, and fix the old wires, and she told him stories not of war or fire, but of skies and rivers and stars that whisper, and the boy called her teacher, and smiled whenever she walked into the room. And one night, he asked her, "Are you a warrior?" And Ray said, "I used to be something else, but now I choose what I am, and today I am yours." And he nodded like he understood more than his age should allow. Minutes passed, and the home grew, and the stars kept spinning, and one day Yolan gave Ray a small metal ring made from the engine that saved them, and said, "I do not need a promise, just a sign that we are walking together." And Ray held the ring and said, "I have walked alone for so long. I forgot what together felt like, but with you it feels like breath and light and truth, and I will walk with you until the stars go dark." And so the girl who was once feared and chained and hunted became something more, not because someone gave her power, but because someone gave her choice. And she rose from pain not as a weapon, but as a protector, a builder, a light in the dark. And those who once called her wild now had no name for what she had become. And Yolan, the human, who raised his hand when all others stayed silent, never once asked for anything in return. Yet in the end he gained everything, because he saw her not as what she was made to be, but as who she chose to become. And that choice changed not just her fate, but the shape of a future that no longer feared her, but followed her.